Okay then, so welcome back. We've all had our lunch. It's warm outside, our bellies are full, and it's afternoon. It's a difficult time for us all. But let me introduce you. One of the main reasons why we're here today and tomorrow for the seminar is Professor Christian Miller, who's the A.C. Reed Honorary Professor of Philosophy from University of Wake Forest, North Carolina. And he's done extensive research in various aspects of virtue, character formation, and moral psychology from a philosophical and psychological point of view. His latest book I just got yesterday morning. Well, I mean, it arrived yesterday morning, but I just got it today, called Honesty, the Philosophy and Psychology of a Neglected Virtue. Some of the topics that he will be talking about today and tomorrow relate to this little book here called The Character Gap. How good are we? I wrote a small piece of that for Areiopagi website that came out last week. If you want to have a brief look have a brief introduction to the themes of the book, you can read that there. But without any further ado, please, Christian, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Good to see you all. Good afternoon. I know it is a difficult time of the day, right after lunch. It's warm and nice outside, so I'm really appreciative that you're here as part of this. I'm also very grateful for all the hard work that went into this. This was planned for 2 years ago. We were actually supposed to do this 2 years ago, and then that fell through, and then it was planned again for last year, and then that fell through, and then it was planned for this year, and here we are. So I'm glad it finally happened. We had a lot of patience, and one of the virtues was on display here. So we had a lot of patience in bringing this about. And so I'm going to be today focusing on some general themes from this book here. Tomorrow I'm going to be diving into a much more narrow, deeper discussion of one virtue, which is honesty. So today will be a little bit more broad strokes, big ideas. Tomorrow will be very focused and narrow. Everyone have a handout? Anyone need a handout? I could do the PowerPoint thing, but I found that sometimes it's nice to be able to go back and look at the earlier ideas and then also have something to take with you after it's all over. Or if you don't like it at all, I guess you could just throw it in the trash. But so, if you find something valuable here, it's something you can take home with you and look at later on. There's a lot here, as you can see. I don't know if we'll get through all of it. We'll just see how it goes and stop when it goes too long. And then there'll be a commentary. I think you're doing a commentary, right? So anything else preliminary? I'm a philosopher at Wake Forest, so that's my approach is philosophical. I've been doing a lot of interdisciplinary work in recent years, though, so I'm reading a lot of psychology and theology, so I'm going to try and bring those into the discussion today. I understand that I'm not an expert in those areas, and I'm certainly welcome to your correction and critique, but I do want this to be really interdisciplinary, bringing into ethics, in moral philosophy, psychology, and theology. All right, and then a connection to the theme of the workshop is that I want to focus on a particular group, Christianity, and what does that group specifically have to say about virtue cultivation? So I'm not going to be talking about how people in general can become better, how can we cultivate the virtues. That's a great topic too, and I say more about that in this book. I'm going to focus just on one particular group, what its own standards are and approaches are for cultivating virtue within that group. And along the way, I'll say a little bit about out-group members too. All right, so what happens here on the handouts? The first couple pages are background. I'm just going to outline my background assumptions about virtue. Not going to argue for them, just clarify where I'm coming from. Background assumptions about empirical research on the bottom of page 1, on to page 2. Not going to argue for that, just tell you where I'm coming from. And then page 3, we'll start getting into Christianity with the first main idea on page 3 with Christian rituals and practices. That'll take us on to page 4, second main idea. Page 5, we'll look at some empirical support. We'll go very much empirical at that point on page 5 and 6. 7 will be an objection if there's time. What about all the harm caused by Christianity? And then page 8, one final idea having to do with the internal work of the Holy Spirit. Okay, so my interest here in this topic is Christianity and virtue cultivation specifically. So I'm wondering about the relationship between these two ideas, Christianity and virtue. I'm not going to be focused on other parts of morality, like right and wrong and good and bad. There's more to morality than just virtue. I'm just wondering, what can Christianity as a group contribute to becoming better virtuously, at least for fellow Christians? So I need to say something about how I'm understanding virtue. So you can look with me here. I'm going to be adopting a standard Aristotelian framework, which is going to be committed to these things. For any moral virtue, pick your favorite one: honesty, compassion, generosity, graciousness, justice, courage, and the like. And then here's some necessary conditions: gives rise to stable behavior over time. So I'll use an example of honesty. You don't get to count as honest if you're just honest on Tuesday. That'd be weird, right? And then not on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So it's got to be over time. It gives rise to cross-situationally consistent behavior. So you don't get to count as honest if you're just honest in the courtroom and nowhere else. You might be honest in the courtroom, but not honest full stop. You got to be honest across situations like conferences, the office, at home, at the restaurant, and so forth. It comes from a character trait, a type of psychological disposition. So I think of virtues as not just a matter of outward behavior, but ultimately virtues are internal psychological dispositions of our minds. They're how we're disposed to think, feel, and act. They include a cognitive component, or a thinking component. And it's better be a virtuous one. It can't be a bad one. It wouldn't be a virtue then. So it's going to be a virtuous cognitive component. So you have to think in virtuous ways. Be motivated virtuously as well. So if your outward behavior is really good, but it comes from motivation that is, say, purely self-interested, maybe to look good in front of others, or to avoid feeling guilty, or to get rewards in the afterlife. Extra handouts we're going to need. I don't know where the pile of handouts went.
There was one.
Oh, there it is, pile right there, yeah. Then that's not going to count as virtuous either, so the heart has to be in the right place as well as the outward behavior. There we go, there it is, good. So number 6 here, gives rise to behavior that's done wholeheartedly without internal psychological conflict. So if I end up doing the right thing, but I have to struggle and I'm tempted and I'm conflicted about it, that's not going to count as virtuous either. We could argue about that. This is Aristotle's view I'm at least going with here. It comes in degrees, so it's not all or nothing. You're not either fully honest or you're not honest at all. The Stoics held that view. I don't think that's a good view to have about virtue. I think virtue comes in degrees. You can look in the diagram here for honesty. There can be strong, moderate, weak honesty. It's a scale, a sliding scale. But there is at some point a cutoff, a threshold. And at some point, your character just doesn't qualify as honest at all, and it's going to be something else. And then finally, last one is excellence of character and is intrinsically good. That shouldn't be too controversial when we think about virtues. So this is not an exhaustive list. Maybe there are other requirements as well. These are the only ones I'm going to be drawing on today. So please don't say that this is all that there is to virtue. But this covers a lot of ground. In the diagram, this is a way to illustrate some of these ideas. So on the left-hand side, we have honesty coming in degrees. On the right-hand side, we have dishonesty. So the vice, the opposing vice, also comes in degrees. There's thresholds for each of them. And maybe there's a middle space between virtue and vice. That's controversial. Some people say if you're not virtuous, you're automatically vicious. Or if you're not vicious, you're automatically virtuous. I don't like that approach. I think that there is middle space between the two, so you could be neither virtuous nor vicious. Aristotle would hold the same position as well. He would say that there's strength of will, continence. There's weakness of will, incontinence, and maybe some other categories, and there's a lot more to be said about that, but I'll just leave it as a question mark for now. And then the last note is mirror image holds for the moral vices. So what I mean by that is you go back up these conditions, you can actually say the same thing about the vices too, just flip it around. Vices are stable, cross-situation consistent, psychological dispositions with a cognitive component, motivational component, give rise to behavior that's done wholeheartedly, come in degrees with a minimal threshold, and not an excellence of character. They're intrinsically bad. Okay? So anything, I'm tempted to stop for questions, but I think we'll do the usual thing of waiting at the end. But please ask anything you want about this, or as we go along, anything else as well. So that's my approach to thinking about virtue. Now, that's conceptual. That's just standard conceptual philosophy, moral philosophy. I've done no empirical work whatsoever. In another part of my research, though, I put the philosophy to one side and look at the empirical data that comes from social psychology in particular, and behavioral economics and some other fields too, and see, well, how good are we? How good are we at living up to the standards of virtue? If these are the requirements, do most people meet them? And I like the psychological research because it gives me an opportunity to take, I don't do the research myself, but I read about it and say, here's a whole bunch of people in this study. They had an opportunity to cheat. Did they do it? Other people in this study, they had an opportunity to lie. Did they do it? Other people in this study, they had an opportunity to help. Did they help or not? And no one study proves anything, but if you start looking at aggregates of these studies, dozens and dozens and dozens of studies of helping, dozens of studies of lying, dozens of studies of cheating, you can start to note general trends and patterns and see whether the behavior that emerges from these studies fits with the requirements of virtue or not. At least that's what I try to do. And so, using behavioral studies in psychology involving morally relevant situations, like the ones like I mentioned, helping and cheating and so forth, I try to examine whether the patterns of behavior and the underlying psychological picture which explains that behavior, so the desires that psychologists are positing, the motivations that psychologists are positing, the beliefs that psychologists are positing, whether that fits with the virtue in question. To expand out a little bit more, we can turn over to spell this out a little bit more carefully. In the case of cheating, for example, on the basis of studies that observe the behavior of participants in different cheating-relevant situations, we can arrive at a plausible picture of the overall patterns of behavior and underlying beliefs and desires which are responsible for that behavior. Not from any one study, but from a collective body of research on cheating. And then after we do that, we can say, are these the behaviors you would expect of an honest person? Or not? And are these the underlying beliefs and desires you would expect of an honest person? Or not? And I'm not going to argue for that, but I'll just tell you number 2 there. The patterns of behavior and underlying beliefs and desires that I see emerging from this research are incompatible with the patterns and mental states pertaining to cheating that constitute the virtue of honesty. In other words, I see a lot of behavior that doesn't look honest to me. And I see a lot of explanations of that behavior involving things like a desire to cheat so as to get in a benefit for yourself if you don't think you're going to get caught. I see that desire playing a significant role, which I would not expect to find in an honest person. So I conclude, therefore, there is good reason to think, on the basis of psychological research, that most people do not have the virtue of honesty. And so back to that diagram again, the arrow for most people is not going to be on the left-hand side. I also run the argument for dishonesty, too. I'm not going to do it today, but I can run the same argument, and I don't see the patterns of behavior that I would expect of widespread dishonesty. And so I don't put the arrow on the right-hand side. I put the arrow in the middle. I think most people, in other words, are not good enough to qualify as virtuous, in this case honest, but not bad enough to qualify as vicious, in this case dishonest. Most of us are a mixed bag. we're in a murky middle of character that has some good sides and some bad sides, but not good enough to qualify as virtuous, not bad enough to qualify as vicious. And so while this picture here is about cheating and honesty, I think the picture generalizes. I think it applies to all the moral virtues, like compassion as well. And so overall, most people have a mixed character, or a mixed bag. For the details about that, this is a good place to start. I've got chapter after chapter about this stuff, but it's not the main focus, it's just the background I'm going to be working with. I do say as a side note, though, I think this does fit well with the Christian approach. That takes the doctrine of the image of God and original sin both seriously. I don't think anything that emerges from the empirical research, as I interpret it, is inconsistent with Christian anthropology, claims made about human beings in the history of Christian thinking about human beings. I'm happy to say more about that too. So actually, I would even put it strong. I think the research that emerges from psychology supports the picture that is outlined in Christian anthropology. The picture that you would have expected to find from a Christian perspective is actually supported by the empirical research. Okay. All right. So now let's turn to Christianity specifically. So what I'm going to argue and what I'm not going to argue. So we're on the bottom of page 2 now. I'm not going to argue that Christianity is the only religion which is capable of fostering virtue. I think that would very, very hard argument to make, and I think it's just not the case. I think plenty of other religions are capable of fostering virtue as well. So please don't hear me otherwise. Indeed, I'm not going to argue that one has to be a Christian or indeed religious at all in order to become virtuous. I think there can be and are virtuous atheists. So I'm not making any kind of necessity requirements here or any necessity arguments that you have to be Christian or even religious to become a virtuous person. All I'm going to be suggesting here is that Christianity has some interesting ideas to offer that are worth taking seriously with respect to cultivating virtue and becoming more virtuous within a Christian community. That's all I'm going to be suggesting today. So what I want to do is, given that we understand what virtue is, and given that most of us fall short, how can we grow in virtue, become better, become more virtuous people? As a general question, that's interesting, but from a specifically Christian perspective, how could that work? How come, using resources specific to Christianity, can we grow in virtue and become more like the persons we're supposed to be, as opposed to the persons we actually are, which are less than virtuous? I think, I'll just say this in passing, from a Christian perspective, the focus on virtue is appropriate. This is the bottom of page 2. Seems to me clear that God cares about virtue, and it's extremely important to him that we become virtuous people. So this is not just an artificial framework imposed upon Christianity, but one that fits naturally within, at least my reading of Christian texts. Here's one passage. For this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, and to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness love. And then next page, have a passage from Colossians, which I'll pass over. I think as well, the background empirical framework fits well with Christianity too. I think the New Testament is pretty clear that we're doing a pretty bad job of being good people, left to our own devices. We're not doing a great job of being virtuous. So I think there are plenty of passages that support that background empirical framework too. And so the question becomes, what steps can Christians take to try to bridge, the title of the book, the character gap. The gap between our actual character and the character we should have, which in this context is the character that God wants us to have. Or maybe even the character that God designed us to have in the first place. What steps can be taken to try and bridge that character gap without bringing the standards down to our level? So keeping the standards high and bringing our character up to the level of the standards. Okay, So I'm going to look at 3 ideas in the rest of the talk for promoting character improvement from a Christian perspective. They're not the only 3 ideas. There are plenty of other ideas for promoting character improvement, and I'll discuss 2 more tomorrow, more reminders and role models, but that's too much to try and tackle for today. So I'll just look at these 3. The first one's going to be Christian rituals and practices, and then page 2 is going to be a social dimension, and then if there's time at the very last page, it'll be the Holy Spirit. That's where we're going. Okay? Sounds good. All right. Here we go. First idea. So rituals and practices that have been at the heart of the Christian life can reliably promote virtue in authentic practitioners as a byproduct, even if that is not the goal of the practice. There's a lot in that sentence I'll read again. Rituals and practices that have been at the heart of the Christian life can reliably, so it's not guaranteeing it, but it can reliably promote, and it's reliably, it's not just a one-off behavioral improvement, but reliably promote virtue in authentic practitioners as a byproduct, even if that's not the goal of the practice. So byproduct versus goal. That's important here. So as a general matter, they're different. If I'm driving my car, my goal is to get to Wake Forest. A byproduct is that exhaust comes out of the car, right? So it would be strange to say my goal is to put exhaust into the air, unless I'm some weird polluter, like all I want to do is just put as much gas as I can into the air. That would be really weird. No, that's not my goal. My goal is to get to my destination. As a byproduct or side effect of that, exhaust comes out of the car into the air. In this context, the analogy, well, the byproduct is supposed to be virtue, so it's not a great analogy. It's not exhaust, it's not a negative thing, it's a positive thing. But the point being that when we think about practices like prayer or tithing or confession, the goal may not be to become a better person when you're engaged in those practices, but a byproduct or side effect of those practices can be becoming a better person. So let's take some examples. Character, sorry. On the bottom of page 3, with prayer is the first example. I say character improvement is rarely the goal. I mean, it can be. You can pray to become a better person. You say, God, help me overcome my temptation, or help me deal with this sin in my life, and so forth. So maybe I probably put that too strong. It's rarely the goal. It's not always the goal. Maybe let's just put that. Sometimes it's the goal, but it's not always the goal. Regardless, though, you can also pray for all kinds of other things that don't have to do with improving your own character. Pray for the state of the world. You can pray for diseases to be cured. You can pray for other people's character. You can pray for lots of things. But whatever you're praying for, it can also be the case that as a byproduct, virtue is strengthened in yourself. So it can foster which ones? Gratitude, compassion, and humility. By expressing gratitude and prayer, the Christian might become a more grateful person in general. So that's just one illustration. Go on to the next page. Confession, another practice here. So the confession can take lots of different forms. I don't mean specifically Catholic context here of going to a confessional and confessing to a priest, but that's fine, and I'm not downplaying that at all, but it can take lots of other forms too. Confessing directly to God, confessing to a loved one, confessing in a small group context with other believers, whatever the case might be. Character improvement may be too strong again, but doesn't always have to be the goal. But in the process of engaging in confession, we can imagine things like courage being enhanced by having to admit a wrong. Strengthen our trust in other people when we share deeply personal information. It takes a degree of humility to confess. When others forgive us, we experience God's forgiveness. Those experiences can make us more forgiving as well. And Christians can be grateful for being forgiven. And this is none of this is exhaustive. These are just specific examples. And then last one, tithing, or just donating, so maybe 10% or whatever percentage that you have in mind, or just no percentage at all. Maybe just you give some amount or other, as it happens to be, to the church. The hope is that temptations and struggles will weaken and the virtue of generosity will be strengthened. And maybe other practices can work like this too. Fasting, reading scripture, worship could be linked as byproducts to different virtues. So that's the first idea here of linking something about Christianity to virtue formation and improvements. What is it? Christian rituals and practices, having virtue formation as a byproduct. All right, so then the second idea. This doesn't usually happen in isolation. Very rare in the history of Christianity is moral improvement a matter of the individual left to his or her devices apart from anyone else. Even in the Desert Fathers in the early history of Christianity would still interact socially with others and still minister to others and still be ministered to by others. So this brings up the second point. The norm has always been to engage in Christian practices together with fellow Christians as part of one body, the church. So this is quick sociological observations, and then why is this matter for character improvement? So when Christians pray, they often do so with other people. They don't have to. They can just pray individually, but it's often the case that it's communal. When Christians confess, I don't know why that's underlined in particular. Maybe I was feeling guilty about something at the time, but that's a mistake. When Christians confess sins, they do so to God and or they say a joint confessional as part of a service. Tithe, often in a public forum, with a collection plate, for example. Worship in front of many people, joining voices together in song, laughter, or prayer. Obvious, fairly obvious observations about Christian practices, but now with maybe less than obvious implications. Because given the fact that this is done communally and socially and interpersonally, it can strengthen character improvements in a number of ways. So I have 4 listed here: support, comfort, role models, and discipline. So the support idea. A Christian is not on her own. Part of a community of millions of fellow believers. So when the Christian needs advice or is going through difficult times, there are others there to lean on, to rely upon, to appeal to for help. For example, when struggling with a deep sin. So it's not a matter of me trying to fix myself apart from the help of others. No, others can surround me and support me in this process. This can be comforting too. There are others on the same path, all working together to become better people. It's comforting to see that it's not an easy road for any Christian. Say, why am I having so much trouble? Is there something wrong about me? No, look at all these other Christians who are struggling too and who have gone through dark nights of the soul in trying to become better people. That can be comforting to see that. Of course, there can be role models here, concrete examples to follow in the Christian's daily life. I'll say a lot more about that tomorrow when I talk about role models, but that should be pretty straightforward points. And then there's even something which today we don't like to talk about as much, probably in previous years in the history of Christianity was more acceptable, but today usually makes some people squirmish. But if your brother goes against you, this is a quote, go and show him his fault, just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you've won your brother over. But if he will not listen, take 1 or 2 others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. The point being that there are forms of institutional discipline which are right there at the onset of Christianity, which can have character building, maybe not so pleasant implications, but nevertheless implications for character building as well. All right, let me stop from this part of it and shift into empirical stuff for a little bit. And then I think we'll be okay to come back and round it out. So where are we bigger picture? Well, the idea is that Christianity, internal to itself, has some ideas that are important to character building and improvement, rituals and practices carried out socially. One question you might ask is, does any of that matter? Is there any actual data to back up the effectiveness of this to growing in virtue? If not, then it might sound good, but might not have any kind of real support behind it. Well, what I want to do in the next 2 pages is suggest that there's maybe some preliminary support for the effectiveness of these strategies, but it's not conclusive. But in fact, it's going to be far from conclusive. So what this does is draws on lots of literature in psychology, but also sociology and behavioral economics, looking on the one hand at measures of religiosity, specifically amongst Christians, and good outcomes. Lots of different good outcomes here, labeled under the heading of crime prevention, education, health benefits, and you can turn over and see, and charity. And sorry, I've got subjective well-being too. I'm not going to focus on all these. I might skip a couple of them in the interest of time. Not all of them are obviously related to moral virtue as well. I should be upfront about that. So I'm just going to focus on the ones where I see the closest link to moral behavior and moral virtue. So why don't I focus on crime prevention, subjective well-being, and charity here. And if anyone wants to look at the others, they can. So for crime prevention, now this is not going to be, of course, exhaustive. I'm just going to select a couple studies for each of these. I've got the citations in the footnotes. You're welcome to investigate them in further detail and look at the larger body of research. For crime prevention, though, these 2 researchers found domestic violence is 60% higher among male survey participants who did not attend church as opposed to men who attend religious services once a week or more. And for partner reports, which are the more important ones here, domestic violence percentage is still 48.7% higher in the non-attender group. Violence committed by women is 44% higher in the non-attender group and 34% higher when their partners are the ones asked. So more broadly, another study here, and again, all the citations are on the bottom, linked religious attendance with reductions of 43 different crimes. Economists have also linked various religiosity measures and decreases in local crimes. So a couple of questions here. Should we take this research at face value? Is it well conducted? Is it replicated in some cases? Or how good are the measures that are being used of religiosity? So all kinds of methodological questions here that are worth asking. And then the second set of questions are, well, what does this tell us about virtue and the morality of the participants here? And that second set of questions is what I'll really be focusing on, and I'll come back to that on page, I should have numbered the pages, but after this section. I'll come back to that in a little bit. Okay, education, lots of interesting links between measures of religiosity and education. Health benefits, same thing. Lots of interesting links here, including even mortality rates. So it looks like there's good reason to think that religious individuals are going to live longer than non-religious ones. But let's skip over to the next page. The ones I want to link more directly to moral behavior and flourishing and virtue. So subjective well-being and charity. Ellison again here found that religious certainty directly correlated with higher self-reported life satisfaction, also positive links for self-reported personal happiness and reduction of stress. And other studies, all kinds of things here. So predicted one's tendency to be satisfied with family life, finances, friendships, and health. increase social support and marriage satisfaction and adjustment. And then the charity one is probably the most directly related to moral behavior. And so I'm going to go slower here. I have more on the handout. Regular service attenders are 25% more likely to give. For volunteering, they outperform rare non-attenders by 23%. In 2000, regular attenders would donate 3.5 times more money per year, and they would volunteer more than twice as frequently. This is from Brooks's well-known book and research here. When we switch to other measures like prayer frequency, spiritual intensity, and merely belonging to a congregation, you still see the same patterns. And it didn't, and this is related again to the in-group, out-group theme of this workshop, it wasn't limited just to charity work towards Christian organizations or for Christian causes. So even other types, that's a typo, sorry, the pattern also held for other typos of charity. That was meant to be types of charity. A typo about typos. Oh well. In 2002, religious people were far more likely to donate blood than secularists, to give food or money to a homeless person, to return change mistakenly given them by a cashier, and to express empathy for less fortunate people. Religious people were 57% more likely than secularists to help a homeless person at least once a month. And last one is this. 20% of fundamentalists, evangelicals, mainline, and liberal Protestants said that they gave away a lot of money at some point in the last 2 years to organizations which focus on the poor. 9.5% of non-religious participants, by contrast, said they did. And then just to report one study in a little bit more detail, the 2002 National Study of Youth and Religion, this is in the US, 2,478 12th grade student reports. And you can see, I won't go through all of them, but you can see differences in the two columns, ranging from smoking to selling drugs, driving tickets, and the like of that. Okay, so I have some time left. Top of the next page, stepping back from these results. Now, you might see these results, and one thing you might do is your eyes might glaze over and say, oh, this is just too much data, and let's get out of this data, let's get back to the philosophy and the theology, which I will say, yep, happy to do that. I like the philosophy and theology. Another thing you might say is, wow, this makes a really powerful case that religiosity seems like it's leading to better behavior. And I think we should be cautious here. I mean, after all, these are merely correlational studies, and so we know why that's going to be of some limited value to us. And it's not clear we can jump right to virtue either, because these studies are just looking at behavior, they're not looking at motivation and the internal psychology of the participants. So since they don't tell us about underlying motivation, it's hard to make claims about virtue cultivation as opposed to just improved behavior. Even if you could get the causation, you don't automatically get the virtue causation unless you know about why is it the case that these religious individuals are donating more to charity, for example. If they're donating more to charity just because they want to get rewards in the afterlife, that's not going to do it for virtue. If they're doing it just so they can overcome their guilt, that's not going to do it for virtue. And it better be for virtuous reasons if we're talking about virtue cultivation. So I want to have a measured response here. Excuse me. As far as empirical research is concerned, the jury is still out on the effect of Christian rituals and practices on character improvement. I suspect that there's going to be causal relationships here. I think the causal relationships are going to go in both directions. So the Christian practices are going to cause better character, but I think this can go in the other direction too. And I suspect there's going to be some improvement in motivation too, but this is just me armchair speculating. So, okay. Now, let me comment for a minute on this, this objection about harm, and I think I'll save time for the end, the last idea, and then I think we'll wrap it up. So natural thought that comes along at this point is, wait a minute, you've been telling a very rosy picture, very kind of one-sided picture. This sounds so nice. Religiosity, in particular Christian religious practices, are going to have these benefits, or at least they could have these benefits for virtue cultivation, and that's way too one-sided. What about all the harm that's been done in the name of Christianity throughout the years? Famous examples being the Inquisition, Crusades, and Salem witch trials. What about how it looks like Christian practices and rituals can lead to vice formation? You've been really downplaying that, haven't you, Miller? And there's a lot to be said here. This is going to be too superficial by way of response, but I'll at least say a few things. I'm especially interested in what you have to say about the critics' follow-up. That's going to be in the bottom of this page. So a standard response to this says, well, wait a minute, it's not as if secular worldviews are doing any better here. Arguably, it's the case that secular worldviews do a worse job of promoting virtue. Well, just look at the 20th century and the secular worldviews that were involved in all the bloodshed that was caused by, and here are 4 examples. So if we're trying to do comparative assessments of which cause more harm, it's not obvious that secular worldviews come out any better. You know, maybe they may come out worse. And then the second common reply is one about reasonability. Yeah, a common point would be, look, these are unreasonable versions of secular worldviews. I mean, Hitler, arguably held a secular philosophy, but it was a bad secular philosophy. It was unreasonable. It had no support for it. Had lots of objections. It's only a matter of secular worldviews which are reasonable and defensible, which can be compared to Christian practices as far as which one promotes virtue more. And when we look at Christian practices which promote the Holocaust, that promote the Inquisition, and promote the Salem witch trials and the Crusades and so forth, and you compare them to secular reasonable worldviews, there's no comparison. Secular reasonable worldviews come out ahead. But, as it says here, religious believers can say exactly the same thing. Only those Christian outlooks which celebrate education, health, helping the poor, and other widely accepted goods should be considered when trying to improve character. So Christian outlooks that celebrated the Crusades, unreasonable. Just like secular outlooks which celebrated the Holocaust, unreasonable. So dismiss those. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about only really reasonable versions of each kind of outlook and compare it side by side. The Christian reasonable outlook has the advantage here when it comes to virtue cultivation. So those are some pretty common points made about the harms of Christianity. What I want to do, just to end up this section, is look a little bit more in the empirical literature, tied a little bit more to the theme of this workshop with in-groups and out-groups by mentioning fairly recent research on religion and racism. So I'm sure that this audience is all familiar with this research. I don't have to say a lot about it, but what about biases towards out-group members? So the first talk was very helpful in setting the stage for this and giving us the background here. So in this very well-known meta-analysis from Hall et al., 2010, they looked at 55 studies of religion and racism, where, I'm not talking about religion in general, most of these participants were Christians, white Christians specifically, and they found that meta-analysis here, so not any one study, but just looking at it collectively, greater religious identification, greater extrinsic religiosity, and greater religious fundamentalism were all positively related to racism. Now, on the other hand, a greater intrinsic religiosity, so caring about religion for its own sake as an end, and not for the sake of, say, social benefits you might getting from being religious. And greater quest, so openness to other perspectives and to being wrong yourself, were negatively related to racism, a relation that reflected racial tolerance. So focusing on that first claim in particular, I think this is very disappointing, obviously, when it comes to virtue. It's very disappointing to see that there's this relationship between, particularly Christianity and racism, apparently, in this body of research. It goes against what I've just spent the last 30 minutes talking about, where Christian practices are supposed to be helpful in fostering improved character. In this case, it might go the other way. So, I mean, I'd love to hear what people have to say about this research who know it well. I'm an outsider to it. I only had a couple of quick observations. One is that the effect sizes were quite small when, say, looking at the relationship between religious identification and racism. The R values were quite small here. 55 studies is not a great deal of studies as well. This is spread out over the course of 50 years of research on religion and racism. And what I also found quite interesting, and this was somewhat encouraging, is that the correlations between extrinsic religiosity, fundamentalism, and identification, and racism decreased quite a bit over the course of the past 50 years. So they were much larger in the 1960s and 70s, and these were almost all American participants. And then when you start moving through the decades and getting closer to the present, the correlations would go down and down and down and down. So some evidence that things were actually improving. So that's something. So I will welcome, of course, thoughts about any of this, but especially if you have some reactions to that. Alrighty, I think I've got 5 more minutes, right? So I'm in good shape. To finish up the last idea here, and to make a general comment. The general comment is, what I've said about Christian strategies for character improvement in terms of religious rituals and practices conducted socially, much of that is not unique to Christianity. It has analogs in all the other major world religions: Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, are a couple that come to mind right away, Confucianism. So these are not unique ideas for cultivating virtue that only Christians can implement or came up with. The last one, though, is unique to Christianity. And it's the idea that God himself is involved in the process of character development. I'll put that way, that also is not unique to Christianity. But how that involvement happens is supposed to be unique. So God himself is work in character development in the form of the Holy Spirit. So one of the central roles of the Holy Spirit in Christian thinking is working out the process of sanctification, the slow, gradual process of trying to restore in the Christian the kind of a person God designed her to be. So thinking of God as a Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and thinking of one of the persons of the Trinity as having as a central role the process of virtue cultivation, at least in believers. That idea I don't think you see in other world religions. And if you do, let me know about it. And I think it's quite a powerful idea because it affirms that Christians are not left to their own devices to become better people, either individually or socially. That God is taking active measures to assist in the process of character improvement. So the Christian perspective is one of human and divine cooperation on the path to becoming people of good character. So it's we're reaching out to God, but God's also reaching out to us and jointly trying to foster virtue. There are fascinating philosophical questions here, which we won't get into unless you want a question and answer, about how this might work. Exactly how is it the Holy Spirit is supposed to be involved in virtue development? I really commend to you, how many of you know this paper by William Alston on the Holy Spirit? One, two. Most don't. If this is of interest to you, check out this paper. It's one of probably my 5 most my top 3 most favorite papers in philosophy of religion ever written. It's just a magnificent paper by William Alston, 1988. And he outlines different models of how this might work. And I'll just give you a couple of the models. God directly makes changes in the believer's psychology. So this might be, those of you the Lutherans in the room might like this kind of model. It's more of a compatibilist approach, where God directly causes changes in the believer's psychology to bring about virtue development. They like the passage like this one: you must work out your salvation in fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you, inspiring both the will and the deed for his own chosen purpose. Another model, this is one that appeals more to Arminians and, say, people in the Methodist tradition. God only tries to influence the believer in a better direction, perhaps using divine callings and communications and exhortations, presentations of God as a role model, the making of his love more obvious, loving encouragements, and so forth. So there's no causation here. It's more leaving it up to the believer's own libertarian free will to make changes, but there's influence and kind of inspiration going on. The Holy Spirit will teach you everything and will call to mind all that I have told you. And then the third model that Alston himself goes with, sanctification involves being drawn into the divine life and participating in it, participating in God to some limited extent. Through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, we come to share in the very being of God. That's a 2 Peter passage. So not going to try and sort these out or get into the details of them, just trying to give a little taste of this more general idea of how the Holy Spirit might be involved from a Christian perspective in the life of the believer. And it's not just in the life of the believer here and now. Because we have excellent empirical evidence to think that when Christians die, they're not perfected. I mean, just look at the people who have died who were Christians, at least, reported Christians. They don't look like they're perfected yet. And so the process will likely continue into the next life. In fact, in recent work, this has been used as a basis for developing a non-standard version of purgatory. You might think that the process of sanctification doesn't get completed in this life. There needs to be more time carried out further in the next life, and that could be a basis for thinking that there is a purgatory where the Holy Spirit continues to do work in improving the character of the believer until it's a perfect character, at which point the process of purgation ends. And what a good note to end on, too. I think the process of giving this talk will end now, and I will look forward to the commentary. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'll just
for this excellent talk. I found this to be a very good intro, general introduction to virtue theory, and also a good summary of several themes that are in this book, which I recommend to everyone to read or even buy. I don't think that it's very expensive for an OUP book. So, okay, I have some general comments and then 3 questions. So if we look at the history of Christian theology, you can see that there's some kind of a weird double bind when it comes to sanctification. Many church fathers, St. Augustine and several others, quite often emphasize both the need of sanctification and also the reality of the sanctification, so that the Christians actually have superior moral lives. And this is a sign of witness to the outsiders. But already in the New Testament, you find these passages which reflect the actual reality in the congregations, where it does seem that their morality is not as good as it's supposed to be. And as we are in a Lutheran country, and many of us work to some extent within or from the Lutheran theological tradition, it's sometimes said that Lutherans shout justification but whisper sanctification, so that everything is the doctrine of justification is emphasized, so that there's no real place for sanctification. And as you started with the Aristotelian notion of virtues, it's well known that Luther threw out Aristotle and the Nicomachean ethics because he didn't like how Aristotle defined what righteousness is, so that you become righteous by doing righteous works. And of course, this is antithetical to the whole idea of Reformation. And that's why in the Lutheran tradition you don't have good theory of agency or a theory of action. Because, I mean, the only good available model is the Aristotelian model, and if you can't use Aristotle, there's really nothing there. So that's why the virtue theorizing has been very problematic for Lutherans. There's some recent works that try to establish that connection. There's some American Missouri Synod Lutheran who published a book on virtues a few years ago. Yeah. Yes, that's the one. I have a few books on virtues, but I don't specifically work from Lutheran tradition in those works. So there is this this kind of both and situation. That there has to be some kind of sanctification, there has to be some kind of cultivation of virtue, but then there is the realization that this is not going anywhere. And maybe if this would go somewhere, it'd also be problematic from the Lutheran perspective, because if you see those fruits of the Spirit, you will devour themselves. So, which leads to my first point. You mentioned the idea of a byproduct. And so if you were to find a place for sanctification within the Lutheran theology, it would be some kind of byproduct. So it's something unintentional. So you are completely focused on something else, but these fruits of the Spirit just keep popping up without you actually paying attention. And if you start paying attention to them, then they will just rot, and you shouldn't, pay attention to those. So my question is, does this actually work in practice? So more specifically, how important is the cognitive element in a virtue cultivation? So that do we have to know what we are doing in order to grow in virtues? So does this byproduct thing work? Okay. Then the second point is about these empirical studies and a correlation, so that we can see that if you attend regularly church services, or if you are active Christian, you are less likely to kill yourself. Or is it like the other way around, that those people who are less likely to kill themselves are more likely to become Christians? I don't know whether that makes sense, but I'm wondering, because this is of course the obvious counterclaim that you can keep. So I was wondering whether there's anything done on that whether in certain cultures there's something in Christianity that draws people who are less suicidal, more honest. And you can do the same with, let's say, on a boy or girl scouts. So whether being a scout makes you an honest person, or is it certain type of people who tend to flock to the boy or girl scouts. And then the outgroup thing. A few years ago, there was a very interesting book published by OUP, edited by Julian Savulescu and Stephen Clark, called Religion. What was the title? I checked it. Religion, Intolerance and Conflict. It's a very interesting book because it has several afterwords, because the conversation kept going while they were producing the book. And the editors wanted to have the final word. So they weren't happy with the actual afterword by Nigel Bigger and several others. But I think it is then very final afterword, Savulescu, who's a former Christian, he's a now atheist, complains about this in-group, out-group thing that seems to arise when you have strong Christian identities. Of course, you can define the identities and the way they are played out in the different ways. But anyway, it seems that it creates this some kind of in-group, out-group distinction, and they suggest that it would be the goal of any virtue cultivation should be a state where there are no borders or there are no in-group, out-groups, that you'd have some kind of absolute altruism, which for me seems nonsensical. I mean, they themselves probably wouldn't like to live in that kind of context. And it seems that these in-group, out-groups are just a part of the system of human societies and networks, so that like it would be impossible for us to understand what would be the word cosmos be like without gravity. It's impossible for us to understand human communities without in-group and out-groups. And this is just a function of the system, and there is really nothing we can do about it. Okay.
Thank you. Can I respond or just go right to questions? All right. Excellent. Thank you. I'll try to be brief and save time for questions too. Let me get the clock here. Great thoughts. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. I think I've got a couple things to say. So I don't know. I'm not an expert in Lutheran theology by any means, but I'm perfectly fine with thinking that justification doesn't have much to do with virtue. And so in being nervous about an Aristotelian framework with respect to justification, while being quite comfortable thinking that virtue has a lot to do with sanctification. So I don't, the making yourself righteous by righteous works, yeah, that's no good. But that's a matter of justification. But making yourself more righteous by, in other words, improving your character by habitually performing good actions, as Aristotle would recommend, could be a part of the sanctification process. So that's the way I like to think about it. It seems like you would be open to that as well. Sanctification is a byproduct, and I like that idea too. But then you ask the question, how important is it to know what we are doing? How important is the cognitive component? Yeah, that's a great question I have not thought much about. I do think that to be a virtuous person in general, the cognitive component better not be too intellectualized. So that would fit well with it just being a byproduct. What do I mean by that, not being too intellectualized? In order to be honest, I don't think you have to think in terms of honesty. When you're contemplating whether to cheat or not, you don't have to think in terms of the concept of honesty. In order to be a generous person, you don't have to deliberate using the concept of generosity. That would be too intellectualized. That would set the bar too high. But instead, you can think about more direct and immediate matters. Can I help someone out who's in pain? In the case of compassion, can I do something to relieve her suffering? In the case of honesty, that would be unfair to the other students in the class, or that would betray the trust that I have with my friend. So these much less intellectualized kind of thoughts, I think, are more than sufficient for the cognitive components of a virtue. And I would be really reticent to make them too intellectualized. but I can say more about that if you like. Whether it's causation or just correlation, yeah, I flag that as well. That's why I think we should be cautious about what we can infer from the studies, since these are just correlational studies. The causation could go in either direction. Yeah, so you provided, you provide both directions with your suicide example, and we don't know what is the correct order of explanation here. There's a little bit of causal work that I've seen being done by Tyler Vanderweel at Harvard that I have not gotten into in a lot of detail, but he's starting to do some causal work, and he's suggesting that the causation runs from the religiosity to the better behavior. In that direction, he's the only one I know who's done even preliminary causal work. So in general, it's an open question. From the armchair, I'm happy to speculate that I think the causation goes in both directions. I don't think we have to have it be one or the other. It can go in both directions. It would be surprising to me if, for example, going to a group of people who go to church for 20 years and every week put money in the offering plate, if that had no impact upon their generosity. That would just be surprising to me. It seems to me that's the kind of practice which carried out habitually over the span of weeks, months, and years would, as a byproduct, foster increased generosity in the person. But that's armchair speculation. And then the last point about, yes, the altruism and in-group, out-group, and what would a kind of radical Christian approach to society look like. And would it be completely altruistic? We get rid of borders, we get rid of property, we get rid of everything else. And since we don't find that, Christians are falling far short of their own standards and are instead entrapped and enmeshed in group divisions which cause harm. I'm sympathetic to your point that it seems like there's no alternative. There's no way of getting around group divisions. But part of me does still feel the pull of the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. And that, I'm pulled by the thought that that is a radically demanding commandment, where neighbor is any human being, geographical proximity or not is irrelevant, social status is irrelevant, etc. All the other group divisions are irrelevant. And the love involved is extremely demanding kind of love. So that I'm supposed to care about that person's well-being maybe at the same level as I should care about my own well-being. And if that's something in the neighborhood of the right way to interpret the second commandment, that does seem like, if ideally implemented in what Kant called the kingdom of ends, and that would lead to a society without a lot of the divisions we have today. Maybe it's just too idealistic. Maybe it's not meant to be real instantiated in this real world. Maybe it's only instantiated in the next life to come. But it doesn't sound like it's meant to just be for the next life to come. It sounds like it's meant to be an obligation. It's not supererogatory. It's an obligation that's imposed upon us in the here and now. And in order to carry it out to this full extent, would lead to a society that looks radically different than ours. So I guess I am somewhat sympathetic to the author's outlook there, which doesn't really help me too much probably, but I'm just being honest, yeah. Thank you, yeah.
What was the Harvard's guy's name?
Yes, Tyler Vanderweel. I'll get you this. I'm not checking my email. Well, actually, I am checking my email.
We can come back to the name.
Okay, I was just giving you a look up the spelling here, but I don't think I'm going to find it right away. So, yeah, the Human Flourishing Center at Harvard.
Okay, so we'll start with the questions. I can be the head person.
Okay, sure.
So let me run an argument by you and see what you think. Premise number one. If God were really actually involved in creating virtue in believers, many believers would be virtuous. and also, it's not just that, it's just that God would also use good or apt tools to produce virtue. Mm-hmm. Premise number two. But not that many Christians are virtuous. Rather, most believers are not virtuous. And some Christian practices you kind of laid out there that they might be useful for cultivating virtue, but this in-group, out-group issue or prejudice and various other things, like, let's say, I see myself as a kind of culmination point of cosmic struggle between good and evil, which can make me a narcissist because I think that, all this battle between good and evil is going on in my soul, and it's the most important thing in the world. All these practices not only cultivate virtue, but they also cultivate certain vices, at least as a kind of byproduct. One could run an argument.
Okay.
And so if you have these two things, then it seems that if God would really use methods to cultivate virtue that don't have the kind of vicious byproducts, and you would expect to find people to be more virtuous, not just a little bit more virtuous, but quite a lot, because it seems God would be quite impotent if he would actually kind of offer this virtue to people, but not that many people became virtuous. So it seems that God is not involved in creating virtue. So if you'd run the argument like that.
No, it's good, it's great. So let's focus on the God direct involvement, as opposed to, you really have two arguments here. One is about the evidence of God's direct involvement, and then the other is about Christian practices. Let's take the main argument you gave, which was if God's directly involved in the cultivation of virtue amongst believers, why isn't God more effective in doing it? Because it looks like he's not. It looks like there's not much virtue amongst believers. I think that's very telling, very important argument. I can think of two things off the top of my head, and then maybe you can help me out some as well. One is that this seems just to be a version of, or can be understood as a version of the larger problem of evil. A lot of the points that are made in the problem of evil discussion could carry over in this context. So if God's in charge and God's fully loving, why doesn't God prevent all these evils from happening? He's certainly able to. He's got the power to. He's got the knowledge. He's got the motivation, and yet these evils exist. And so that gives us some reason to think that God's not one of the omni properties. Seems like a lot of the same defensive moves there. Skeptical theism, for example. Well, maybe God has a reason, but we just don't understand what it is. Could carry over in this context. Maybe God has a reason for why he's not moving the needle faster than he is, and we just don't know what that reason is. So I would be interested to see if we can do a one-to-one mapping. Skeptical theism over here, could that carry over? Hasker's gratuitous evil response, could that carry over? This, and I bet there you would find a lot of carryover. Second point is more direct response, which is also has an analog in the problem of evil literature, which is I think I favor a model of God's involvement which is more inspirational than causal. Now, inspiration can be causal too, but what I mean by that is, as opposed to God directly involved, causing changes in the believer's psychology, where if that's what God's doing, your argument has a special force, right? But since I don't like that idea, that approach to thinking about divine agency vis-a-vis humans in general, and I adopt a more libertarian approach to free will, so you can kind of see where this is going, I'm going to prefer an approach where God is more hands-off and maybe trying to inspire us and remind us and so forth, but still leaving it up to us to carry out the process of sanctification, ultimately. And then if you're going to leave it up to us, well, you're going to, no surprise, going to find us doing a pretty crappy job at it. So, and that just is a version of the kind of free will defense in the problem of evil literature. So really I gave you 2 points, but they're really just 1 point, which is carrying over discussion from the problem of evil.
Yeah, I guess my argument would have more bite against those views of sanctification that first of all, have quite high standards and also involve close causal interaction.
Yeah.
Like the Lutheran view, as far as I understand it, is one of these kinds of views.
Yeah, but note that that same point would carry over to the problem of evil literature too. We were over lunch. We were talking about why is it that so many Christian philosophers are libertarians, whereas in the larger philosophical community, so few philosophers are libertarians, and compatibilism is such a common view. I think one big explanation for that is precisely because Christian philosophers worry about how a compatibilist approach is going to deal with the problem of evil. They think it's going to make the problem of evil a lot worse and harder to respond to, and therefore their views about the problem of evil drive their views about agency as opposed to the other way around. So I would go the same way here.
I will just skip my Lutheran objection to Aku and have the question before. There's been a lot of talk about this in-group and out-group and the negative effects of that. And in the previous presentation we had, and also the connection to racism, but it also seems to me that, especially based on your presentation, that a lot of the good things are tied to the community and the in-group. So clearly there is a temptation to dispense with the group totally, as was Savulescu who was trying to do that. Is there any way that we could modify the group? I mean, if it's the case that we cannot dispense with, we just can't live without some groups. How would it be possible to, or is it possible to modify the group so that it would create less these negative effects? As in the case of racism, it seems to have declined, you said. So what would be a response to that?
That's a big question. I don't know if I have much to offer. Let me start with a general point that it's very common in this discussion of group effects to go negative right away and think in-group, out-group, oh, that's got to be a bad thing. Let's try to think of ways to combat that. So in the first presentation, presented the in-groups and out-groups, and then presented different models for trying to deal with the effects of that. So, broaden the scope of the in-group, get people to think of themselves in larger categories, all these things, with the implicit assumption that this is a bad way to be psychologically put together. And I think I share where you're coming from, which is that sometimes in-group, out-group differences are just fine, and in fact are better than the opposite. So let's get a couple examples. My family is a group. I behave towards my family in ways I don't behave towards outsiders. I prioritize my family when it comes to, say, healthcare and presents and gifts and so forth in a way that I don't to strangers. Ordinary morality would say that that's perfectly fine and that's a good thing. I wouldn't want to change that. Now, this goes a little bit against the second commandment idea. Maybe I'm making a mistake here, but let's leave that aside. So I think it's a mixed bag. We have to go case by case, whether group divisions are morally acceptable or not. Now, the second part of your question was, well, how can we, when there are problems, how can we deal with them? Is that, if I'm right, while still keeping group structures in place? And that's probably beyond my capacity to address as a general matter. I think we could go take a particular example, a case study, and think about how we might think through that to try and address some of the problems. But as a general matter of all in-group, out-group effects that are negative, how do we address them? I don't know if I have anything to offer there. Did I speak to what you were saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's beyond my ability.
Yeah. It would be a Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
So if the sanctification is a process, so
Yep.
it happens gradually,
Yep.
is there any empirical study measuring the degree of virtuousness that takes into account how long one has been a believer. And also comes to my mind that could that solve the problem of, is it which one is the cause? If those who have been believers for a longer time, you would think that the cause that they are virtuous is because they have been believers.
Yeah. Good. A lot of tricky issues here. I don't think it's quite so straightforward. I wish it was. So methodological and then empirical here. As a matter of fact, there are very few studies like that. So first of all, your direct question was, are there any studies like this? No. Methodologically, there are challenges to carrying out these kind of studies. And then philosophically, I'm not sure you can draw the conclusion you were wanting to draw. So there aren't very few studies like this. Why? Well, if you're going to do them correctly, you're going to want to carry them out longitudinally. So you're going to want to identify individuals who are supposed to be part of your study, and then you're going to track them over the extensive period of time. That's hard to do empirically, whatever you're measuring, to track the same group for a long period of time. But there are longitudinal studies of other things. When it comes to character, you're going to need to have a good way of assessing character of these individuals initially, to get the baseline for their character, and then you'll do follow-up studies after 3 months, after 6 months, after a year, after whatever chunks of time, using the same measures of virtue to see if they've improved or not. Is that so far so good? That can be done. That's challenging though, to first figure out what is a good measure of virtue. Are we going to use self-reports? Are we going to use behavioral reports? Are we going to use experience sampling methodologies? I can say more about these different approaches. But suppose we get the measure, we got to keep an eye on those participants over time. Okay, so now let's suppose we do all that, and we have one group who we are tracking, who have been believers for a long time, and another group who are tracking, who've been believers fairly recently. That's the thought, right? And frankly, in that kind of setup, you don't even need to track them over time. You just need to get one measure. You could even do one measure, right? You could say, here's this group who've been believers for a long time. Let's measure their virtue. And here is this group who recently converted to Christianity. Let's measure their virtue. So you need a longitudinal study, right?
Yeah, I think that's,
Yeah. So then, last complication, though, is you need to know where they started from, too. So suppose, and you don't want to do this just at the group level, you want to go individual. So let me give you an example. Let's suppose in the people who have been believers for a long time, there's an individual who started out as a teenager having a very, very bad character. Converted and has been a believer for a long time, but that person's character is only decent now. You with me, right? Now in the other group of the recent converts, there's someone who was already pretty good. In fact, virtuous. And then converted, and then their character is assessed. Well, their character is going to turn out to be higher than the character of the person who's been a believer a long time.
why not just take averages, like here in this one table, you have these like weekly religious
Yeah.
religion, and just add how long they have been believers.
Yeah. I guess you could, if you can assume that that's going to wipe out the individual differences between the members of the group. So then what would that tell you? If the group of believers who's been believers a long time is higher on the measure of virtue than the group believers who converted recently, and you're allowed to assume that, you would take that to be evidence that at least is consistent with the sanctification hypothesis. Yeah. Of course, we don't know how much. It's hard to disentangle what is supposed to be God's role and what's supposed to be the role of just the normal practices, rituals and practices. Yeah. Okay. I had to work it out with you together. Others should jump in on this. What would that tell you? It seems like it'd be consistent with the sanctification happening, but it wouldn't tell you anything about specifically divine causation in the sanctification process. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I like that. Yeah. Sorry, it took me a little while to get there. Yeah, I just needed to talk it over with you. Yeah. I see two hands.
Did you have something, Laurie?
I'll leave it for later.
Okay, so Mika.
Thank you. So, short question. You mentioned the paper that you liked. It was something like top 5. Was it the Alston 1988?
Yes. Yep.
All right. So then I have an actual question here. So,
anyone who has trouble getting that, it's in an edited collection with Cornell University Press. That's probably hard to track down, but I have a PDF of it that I can unethically send to you. If you need.
I think that paper circulates around online, so you'll probably find it online.
I get it as well. So.
Yeah.
It's definitely worth your time.
You did have a question.
Yes. So you mentioned tithing.
Yes.
When Christians tithe or donate more generally, they often do so in a public forum, such as and so forth. But the point being that the act of tithing is beneficial to virtue cultivation. So I offer a very short thought, and I'd like your comment. In my understanding, if you force someone to tithe, in the sense that you tell them, you must do this, or if you don't do this, then evil things will happen to you, then it will cause people to tithe. But my understanding is that if you force someone to act according to virtue, you actually rob them of the opportunity to cultivate their virtue because you force them to. So I'd like to get your comment on that. How can you actually rob someone of their opportunity to be virtuous by forcing them to do according to virtue?
Yeah, good. Yeah. I think the answer is yes. Your question is, can that happen? And the answer's got to be yes. And your point doesn't apply just to tithing. It generalizes across the board, right? I think the idea would be, even if, you also put this hypothetically, if you force them. Plenty of people can tithe without being forced to do so. They can say voluntarily, I think this is a good practice, I'm going to choose to embark on it. I'm going to choose to do this. But if I think what you have in mind is someone who is doing this because they're told they have to. And I guess two thoughts. One is, initially, that doesn't seem like it's going to be virtue cultivating because the motivation isn't going to be the right kind of motivation. And for me, it's not just, even if the outward behavior, they actually do it, they tithe every week. If the motivation is in the right place, it's not going to be helpful for, it's not going to be sufficient, at least, for virtue development. But second point is that there's a hope, at least, that over time, one's motivation can change. So initially, one is doing it because one has to check a box or to meet the requirements. But over time, one can be immersed in a practice and come to see it in a different light, come to appreciate the virtue of it, the merits of it, the goodness of it for its own sake. And say, in this case, I did this initially because I had to, but I've come to see that this is actually a really good way to live. And there's a lot of value to this. And so I'm going to do it because of that value, and not because I was forced to do it. And so the motivation pivots, and now it becomes more virtuous. Is there a guarantee that will happen? No, by no means. Could it happen? I think yes. So could it happen that initially someone starts out being forced to do something and eventually comes to see value in it and adopts the right kind of mindset and a virtuous mindset? I think yes, that could happen.
But it would be unbeneficial beneficial in the beginning. That might be my point. Would you agree that that there is the robbing effect if you force something?
Unbeneficial in a sense of not virtuous, not immediately conducive to virtue. It can still be beneficial, well, to give. I mean, people who receive the money, they're benefited, so that's beneficial. And it can be beneficial to repeatedly do good actions. Aristotle emphasized again and again and again and again the value of repeatedly doing the right thing. But nevertheless, I still agree with your point that it doesn't give you the right kind of motivation and mindset. And so it's an obstacle to virtue early on. Yes? Yep.
Okay, I don't think we have time for any more questions, so join me in thanking Christian for this talk. If you have further questions,